you're very welcome to this interview with the Corporate Governance Institute. Today we have Anne-Marie Taylor, who is a seasoned non-executive director on boards, including the Public Appointment Service, the UCD Governing Authority, and the Irish Hospice Foundation. Anne-Marie is currently a partner with Board Excellence, responsible for non-executive director search and selection. Most of her career was with Accenture, where she held a number of local and global roles. And she is also co-founder of the Board Diversity Initiative, which produces a directory of senior women suitable for board roles. You're very welcome, Anne-Marie.
Great to see you, Stephen. I'm delighted to do this interview for you.
Great. And I suppose we'll start where we should start. You know, your role in Board Excellence, a very interesting organization. What does Board Excellence do?
Okay. Board Excellence mostly does external board evaluations. We're kind of renowned for very honest and very thorough evaluations. We don't really do tick the box evaluations. We kind of look under the covers. We give very candid feedback. And that can be uncomfortable, but it's also very rewarding for boards that actually really want to improve. We also do board and director best practices training. We do board dispute mediation. And then we do board search and selection, and that's the area that I'm responsible for. We cover all sorts of boards. We do stock market listed boards. We're actually a partner of the London Stock Exchange for board evaluations. We do private equity venture capital company boards. We've quite a lot of expertise in the investment space. And we do private boards, family-owned boards, subsidiary boards, scale-up boards, startup boards, charity boards, not-for-profit, public sector, basically the full range of all sorts of boards.
It's amazing how the breadth and range of access to boards you have there. You think organizations are becoming more focused on their boards and how a strong board can help deliver and drive better business outcomes?
Sure. Yeah, we really are finding that organizations are much more conscious now that a board can actually contribute real business value. Like in the past, boards were often seen as kind of a necessary evil that had to be in place for regulatory reasons. But this has very much changed over recent years. It's pretty evident at one end of the spectrum where smaller companies are deciding to add their first non-executive director. So they're getting into the non-executive space. And then at the other end of the spectrum with larger companies that already have boards, they're taking a much more rigorous approach to the recruitment of new non-execs. Increasingly, they're taking a good look at the skills on their current boards, and they're then preparing a formal specification of what gaps they need to fill in their next appointments. And they know that having skilled, experienced and engaged directors can actually make a real difference to the direction of the company. Another sign that organizations are increasingly recognizing the value of an effective board is the growing focus, and I'm sure you've seen it yourselves, on comprehensive board evaluations, which actually aim to continuously improve the board. And we're finding a lot of what we would call learning boards that really want to adopt a high performance culture.
Yeah. Now, this interests me a lot, you know, the notion of the concept or actually the practice, you know, of a high performing board. What would you say constitutes a high performing board? Okay.
Well, Board Excellence has done hundreds of board evaluations, and we've also done a lot of research on board evaluations. And as a result of all of this experience, we tend to use a 6-point scale to rate the performance of boards. So at the top, there are what we call high performing boards, then strong boards, then effective boards, then average, then mediocre, and then dysfunctional boards. And we find in general, and this holds true pretty much across all sectors, that about 10% of boards are high performing, about 10% are strong, about 15% are effective, about 25% average, about 25% mediocre, and amazingly, about 15% of them are dysfunctional, which is kind of a sad reflection. Now, interestingly, the experience level of the directors is actually no guarantee of a high performing board. Some of the boards that we've evaluated have directors from the ranks of the good and the great, but the boards themselves have actually been completely dysfunctional. And actually, if I can digress for a moment, I've recently been watching a couple of Apple TV drama series about large corporate failures. You may have seen some of them yourself. The first one is The Dropout, which is about Theranos, which is the company founded by Elizabeth Holmes. And she was recently convicted of criminal fraud, and she's potentially facing a fairly lengthy prison sentence. Now, in 2015, which was only 7 years ago, Theranos was valued at $15 billion, $15 billion, okay? The company no longer exists. Now, who was on the board? Well, just the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, a former Defense Secretary, a couple of senators, a former director of the Center for Disease Control. So the good and the great, but none of them seemed to spot that the company was actually built on sand. And then the other series that I was watching is We Crashed, brilliant series, which is the story of WeWork. That's the co-working office space company. They were valued at $47 billion, $47 billion, just before they were due to IPO in 2019. That's only 3 years ago. The IPO was pulled at the last moment because of governance and other issues. And now they eventually IPO'd last year, 2 years later, at a valuation of $9 billion, and they have a new CEO. Again, they had a really high-powered board. Incidentally, it was actually an all-male board. We'll come back to that. Now, were they asleep on duty? Who knows? But clearly, they weren't a high-performing board. So, back to your question then. What constitutes a high-performing board? Well, we see a number of characteristics. Have I gone mute? You've gone mute. There are a number of characteristics of high-performing boards. It'll be no surprise to people listening to this interview that the single most important characteristic of a high-performing board is an effective chair. Yeah. An effective chair sets the tone and the culture and optimizes the performance of each board member. You know this. But another important characteristic is a high level of trust, both amongst the board members and between the board and the executive. And this is a really important balance to get right. And the board, on the one hand, has to support the CEO and the executive team, but at the same time, they have to be able to robustly challenge and debate. They kind of have to find that what we call Goldilocks zone, where the relationship with the CEO is neither too hot, or in other words, too close, or too cold, too distant. A couple more characteristics. Another one is the level of engagement of the directors. Engaged directors come to each meeting well prepared. They engage in respectful but robust challenge. They hold the executive to account, and they generously share their expertise. They make themselves available outside board meetings if that's required to support the CEO and the executive. Now, you may be thinking, well, is my board a high-performing board? So if you want to do a little exercise, if you're listening to this and you're a board member, imagine your next board meeting is being streamed live to your shareholders and stakeholders. This is quite a sobering exercise. So imagine if the shareholders or the stakeholders were asked after the meeting to assess both the collective board and each individual board member on, say, their contribution, their value add, their preparation for the meeting, the level of challenge and debate, the level of engagement and collaboration, the leadership from the chair and the CEO, the diversity of thinking. And then imagine at the end of the call, the stakeholders were asked to vote, 1, whether to retain a board member, 2, whether to replace the board member, 3, whether to retain the board, or 4, whether to replace the board. That's quite an interesting exercise to think about when you're facing your next board meeting. I also think it can be quite a useful exercise for a CEO to ask himself or herself, would this company or organization be any different if the board didn't exist?
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that's quite interesting. Now, sometimes it can suit a CEO to have a board that's a passive board that doesn't challenge them and effectively doesn't contribute any value add. Like, there are definitely some CEOs who tend to only bring good news to the board. They don't ask for help. They gloss over issues. They even walk through lengthy PowerPoint status updates and thereby minimize the time for discussion or debate at the board meeting. But I always think these CEOs are missing a real opportunity to tap into the expertise of their board, to get access to the diversity of opinions, to kind of open themselves up to new ways of developing the company and to debate strategy. Now, I also think that there are probably some people listening to this interview who may be on several boards. And I'd say, think about the level of participation on each of those boards when the pandemic struck.
Yeah.
Now, this was an unprecedented crisis. So for most directors, there were probably some extra meetings. And certainly our research would show that directors put in a lot more time over the last couple of years. But if there weren't any extra meetings, was this because maybe the crisis didn't materially impact that particular business? Or maybe was it because the board is not considered central to the decision-making in that company or organization? And you know what, that can be a bit of a warning sign. So reflect back on the boards and see, you know, were you involved in the pandemic or not? And it's also useful for board members to ask themselves the same question as the one I posed for CEOs. If this board didn't exist, would it make any difference to the board, to the company or organization? So even at a micro level, and I try to do this myself, ask a board meeting, after a board meeting, ask yourself, if we hadn't had that board meeting, would anything have been different? If I hadn't been at that board meeting, would it have made any difference? Think about what the board, as opposed to the organization, has achieved over the past year. What has the board done that the organization wouldn't have done without the board? Now, obviously, you know, board effectiveness isn't just confined to the boardroom itself. The mere fact of having a board improves compliance and ensures that actions are taken behind the scenes. Some of the benefit of board meetings is in the preparation by the executives. Knowing that they have to present to the board and the material be scrutinized does ensure a level of rigor in updates and in plans, but it's not sufficient. There still needs to be healthy debate and discussion within the boardroom. It is the job of the board to make the big calls on strategy for the company. And if they're not doing that, you have to wonder why they're there at all. So Stephen, pretty long answer to your question, but I hope I covered everything I know about high performance boards.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And that you know, a good non-executive director being the critical friend, not afraid to challenge, not afraid to pry into areas the CEO may not want want to have a look at, you know. But you recruit a lot of non-executive directors, or NEDs, or NEDs as they're called. Are there trends in this recruitment now? You did mention that there were smaller companies recruiting NEDs for the first time. There are bigger companies looking at the specific skill set of the NEDs. Are there specific skills in high demand, like ESG or digital transformation, for example? Sure,
yeah. Now, I generally find that boards are looking for two types of directors. They look for generalists and they look for specialists. Now, usually the chair will be a generalist, somebody who has prior board experience, is a good facilitator, a good leader, a strategic thinker, and they probably come from a senior executive role. And then often, but of course not always, the non-exec directors will have specialist expertise. So they may be specialists in say a specific sector, maybe engineering, or they may have some sort of functional experience, like, you know, people with HR skills or skills in scaling a business or mergers and acquisitions or maybe international expansion. But definitely at the moment, so those skills are always in demand, but at the moment, we're also seeing heightened demand for specialist skills in the areas that you mentioned: ESG, cybersecurity, digital transformation, and now with hybrid working, people with people management skills.
Yeah, and that's really what an NED brings to the table, isn't it? It's normally that kind of sectoral specific experience that the organization wants, somebody who's been there and done that.
Yeah.
You're now, I suppose the question we get asked a lot, you know, and because we're in the business of training people to be effective board members, but you know, aspiring board members searching for their first board role, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I'm regularly approached by candidates who are looking for their first board role. And there are a few things that you can do, though some of the suggestions I make won't be suitable for everybody. But ideally, you would, and this is not always very helpful, but ideally you'd start thinking about it long before you hope to get your first role, because there's usually a very long lead time in getting the first board role. They tend to come in after the first one, but the first one can be hard. So if you can, if you're in an executive role, start orienting your executive career to acquire those kind of skills and experiences that'll be valuable in the boardroom. So that might be, that might involve acquiring some of those hot skills that I mentioned, like ESG, cybersecurity skills. It is important to have a role with P&L responsibility. We definitely find that people with P&L responsibility are more likely to get on boards. So running an operation, running a small division, running business, whatever. International experience can help. Increasingly, particularly for scale-ups and startups, M&A, VC, fundraising, PE, scale-up, startup experience, that's in huge demand, particularly in the SME type sector.
Yeah.
It's also useful if you can actually get board experience within your own company. So maybe on a subsidiary board, or even if you put yourself in a position where you're reporting regularly to the main board. So try to get some boardroom experience, even if it's reporting to a board. Do check with your company if they will allow you to sit on an external board. Some companies are really supportive of this and find it a really good developmental opportunity for their senior executives. Some companies don't allow it for conflict of interest reasons, but some do. Obviously, it's always useful to have a board under your belt. So think about joining a voluntary board or a state board. If anybody who's interested in getting their first board role is not already registered with state boards, do that today. Just register with state boards. State boards have a huge range of boards and provide a great opportunity to develop boardroom skills and to contribute to our community. And I'm sure there are equivalents of state boards in other countries as well. At a more micro level, tell people in your network that you're looking for a board role. Like, if they don't know you're looking, they won't consider you. So let people know that you're looking for a board role. And along the same lines, on your LinkedIn profile, in the About section, indicate that you're open to board roles. So just say open to non-executive director roles.
Right. People
like me in search firms use LinkedIn, and we all use the search facilities in LinkedIn. So if you have open to non-executive director roles in your About section, there's a better chance that you'll be spotted. So no downside to doing that. You should also consider a governance qualification. Some larger boards can absorb a director who has neither prior board experience nor a qualification. But most boards can't afford to have somebody on board who doesn't know anything about governance or how a board operates. Now, obviously, I have no vested interest here, but a qualification such as the Corporate Governance Institute diploma will give both the board, will give a board comfort that you at least know something about governance, and will also give you comfort in your role. You don't actually need a qualification to get on the board, but if you don't have prior board experience, it really can help. And finally, talk to a non-executive director recruiter like me. So if there are people listening to this and they feel they have the skills and the experience to be a director, feel free to get in touch, and Stephen will pass on my contact details.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And just as a side to that, the characteristics, we often talk about the hard skills, but I've written about this before and interviewed people about the soft skills that are in high demand. The emotional intelligence required to be a board member. What characteristics do you feel make an effective or an influential director in the boardroom?
Yeah, okay. Well, there are a few things that I think are important in effective directors. First of all, just being prepared, like reading the papers in advance, thinking about what questions you want to ask, and it's not just what you want to ask, but it's how you ask it. Choosing your words with care, and this is back to the empathy that you mentioned. If you are going to ask a challenging question, you might think about providing the chair or the CEO with a question in advance so they're not caught off guard and you give them a chance to perform well. It is your job as a director to challenge, but it's not your job to intimidate or be aggressive. And also, preparing in advance means You're more likely to think independently and avoid groupthink when you all get together. So I would say prepare in advance. Secondly, bring your A game to every board meeting. Speak up at the meetings. Always try to add serious value. I spoke earlier about asking yourself some questions after a board meeting. Ask yourself, did I add value today? Did I add value to that board meeting? Another characteristic of an effective director is somebody who builds trust with their fellow board members and with the CEO and the executive team, because there will come a time when you have to deliver the tough love messages. And if you have built up a level of trust, it would be much easier for the recipient to receive those messages. Be curious. Make sure you understand the sector or the sector that the company or organization is operating in, and keep yourself up to date with developments in that sector. As you said, be respectful, listen to your fellow directors, listen to the CEO, the executive team. Always be supportive of the CEO and executive team. Offer your expertise both at the meetings and offline. A good way to support the CEO is to ask him or her, what's keeping you awake at night? How can the board help? And then, of course, be prepared to roll up your sleeves, as many had to do during the pandemic. And finally, you're on the board for a reason. You're probably, if it's on a commercial board, you're being paid. So pull your weight. Make sure you take on your share of committee roles.
Yeah.
So a few pointers there.
Oh, excellent advice. Really, really good advice. Finally, Anne-Marie, you're the co-founder of the Board Diversity Initiative. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the Board Diversity Initiative, I set it up with a former colleague, Vivian Jopp, about 12 years ago. It's a directory of women who are willing and qualified to serve on boards. And the reason we set it up was about 12 years ago, we were interested at gender balance on boards, and we spoke to a number of board chairs at the time. And you know what, they all said, yeah, we'd love to have more women on our boards, but you know what, we just can't find them. Well, that was kind of a red rag to a bull. Yeah. So Vivian and I were convinced it wasn't a supply issue. So we went out and we found very senior women to include in the directory. And we started with 46 back in 2010. And then last year we produced the 6th edition of the directory, which included 150 amazing women. And then late last year, we very proudly handed the directory over to the 30% Club, where it now has a sustainable future, because Vivian and I just couldn't continue with it. So, and then I was program director for Balance for Better Business, which was set up in 2016. That was an initiative set up by the Taoiseach at the time, in conjunction with business leaders, to address issues with gender balance on the boards of Irish companies. We set targets for women on boards and for the leadership teams of large Irish companies, both public and private companies. Yep. In 2018, when we started, 18% of directors on the largest Irish PLCs were female. And we're very proud to say that by March of this year, that had increased to 32%, which really is a phenomenal increase. And it really shows the power of targets. I firmly believe in targets. Now, there's still a long way to go on other types of boards, but that's a really good start. Yeah, excellent, excellent.
And you know, we read a lot about, and we talk a lot about diversity. Diversity isn't just, you know, gender related, it's everything, isn't it? Is that coming? You know, are people's backgrounds, are people's, you know, cultures, ethnicity and everything, is that coming to the fore?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the thing is, gender is very visible. So if boards aren't even getting gender right, the chances are they aren't getting the other elements of diversity right. Okay, so that's the one we can measure very easily. But all the other aspects are just as important. So age, ethnicity, sector background, professional background, but most importantly, thinking styles, because diverse boards lead to much better decision-making, better ability to cope with crisis, less risk of groupthink. And I can't help but think that better diversity on the boards of Tyrannus and WeWork might have avoided some of their issues. So yeah, and there's a lot of empirical research at this stage to show that more diverse boards lead to better profitability, better business outcomes.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, it was great talking with you today. I certainly learned a lot. And I think our readers and our viewers will as well. So thanks very much.
Great. Pleasure, Stephen. Thank you very much.